And welcome back. So continuing from the recent history of Antarctica, I'm going to give a brief summary in this lecture about the modern status of Antarctica in terms of we've talked a little bit about Antarctic research and about some of the bases there when we did human geography. This is a summary of conservation in Antarctica as well as continued economic activity and some recent geopolitical conflicts that have underscored the need for the Antarctic Treaty. And then next week, we will continue on to climate change, which is kind of the big elephant in the room I haven't really been addressing as closely during this because it needs its own lecture. And of course, it kind of functions as a good coda to the human history because it is human-caused changes to the climate and environment of the world and Antarctica. There we go. Sorry, I just had to fix the slideshow. So I'm going to start this half of the lecture by outlining the difference between two concepts that I found easy to mix up for a lot of my life, and those are preservation and conservation. And preservation is the goal of leaving the state of an environment untouched by human impact or as close to untouched as possible. And conservation is achieving a healthy ecosystem while leaving room for sustainable use of natural resources. And conservation is a more desirable approach and outcome much of the time. If the goal is for humans to modify their behavior overall so that we don't destroy the environment. And it's also preferable if you're trying to respect the wishes of indigenous people who have been gathering plants or hunting or building structures in low impact ways previously that didn't destroy the environment, and they don't want to be left out of that. That's a bit of a moot point in Antarctica because there have never been indigenous people living here. So the framework put in place by the Antarctic Treaty System has leaned much more heavily towards preservation, but there is still some economic activity that goes on in Antarctica, even though specific activities like fossil fuel extraction are explicitly prohibited. So to what extent any economic activity can be sustainable is questionable, and it's an open question whether Antarctica in particular can at all be used for fishing or tourism or other human activities without its environment becoming degraded. And I would say that overall, Antarctica is pretty rigorously and well protected from pollution and environmental destruction. That protection is in general enforced and respected, and humans have a much smaller footprint in Antarctica than they do anywhere else. But no human activity just leaves no footprint whatsoever. Even the presence of a few well-meaning scientists who are taking every possible precaution to do it sustainably and responsibly, that's still going to leave an impact, my own research included. And when I was there, we had to document where our helicopter had landed, how long we had been at different camps, and even how many tubs of human waste we had generated at each camp. I'm not joking, because this was done as part of an impact report so that if future research were done anywhere near where we were, researchers might consider not using our exact same locations so that they would not be overused. And it would also provide information on kind of what level of human waste is generated out there. They had also had us record how many bags of trash. So also, if tourists or people who are fishing are present, they're going to have an impact too. The number of tourists who can come to Antarctica is limited, and the treaty is meant to enforce fishing limits, including the number of boats that can be in Antarctic waters at any given time. One example of how the mere presence of humans at McMurdo creates a footprint is microplastics. So unless you have a purely natural brand like Dr. Bronner's, and you can usually spot those because they don't make as much foam as conventional soaps do, but most soaps and body washes and shampoos and a lot of bathroom products have microplastic beads in them that serve as exfoliants or as various other purposes. And these tiny bits of plastic don't get filtered out by water treatment plants. They have been detected in the water in increasing numbers, not just in worldwide, and also in Antarctica. So there is wastewater treatment at the McMurdo base, but it doesn't get microplastic beads. And the long-term impacts of this aren't known, but of course, plastic in the water is generally not a good thing. And they've responded by banning conventional bathroom products at McMurdo base and requiring people to use microbead-free products. So I ended up bringing Dr. Bronner's, which is a good kind of all-purpose soap, just because, not shilling for them, I promise, but just because I wanted to comply with that. They didn't check very closely though, so it seems to be kind of based on an honor system, which is, like, I get that you want to trust the scientists, but scientists are people too and need the reminder. Anyway, Comparatively, though, most of the pollution doesn't come from Antarctica. There's not that many people there. The pollution is mostly from elsewhere. And it's pretty easy to contain pollution from the tiny human population in Antarctica. It's not so easy to contain pollution coming from elsewhere in the world, like the chlorinated fluorocarbons in the atmosphere from aerosol cans that contributed to ozone depletion, or the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is causing Antarctica to get warmer. And really, the global problems of those have to be tackled before much can be done about their effects on Antarctica. And it kind of does show the limits of protecting one area and not dealing with the problem elsewhere. Sooner or later, the problems from elsewhere are going to creep into Antarctica. It's kind of like if you watched far enough in Encounters at the End of the World, one of the scientists says, the other world is kind of sending stuff to Antarctica and Antarctica is responding. And it's like, yeah, Antarctica is melting because of global warming from fossil fuel emissions elsewhere. And everything is tightly regulated in Antarctica, but there are some areas that have tighter regulations than others. And that is the equivalent of a national park or an Antarctic Specially Protected Area, or ASPA. And permission is needed to enter, let alone or collect samples or undertake scientific operations. And in some cases, even flying over these areas is regulated. And the types of areas they set aside for ASPAs include historical sites in which they have huts or boats or other relics of early exploration, or places where unusual microorganisms might live, so extremophiles or other fragile ecosystems, or where you have natural features like ice features or ventifacts, the wind erosion features, or soil crust that could easily be damaged by humans not being careful. And a good example of this is Blood Falls, which I briefly spoke about earlier when you learned about extremophiles. The protocol for Blood Falls says that you can fly over without a permit and you can walk on the surface of a glacier without a permit, although you already technically need a permit to be there because the dry valleys are also part of an ASPA. So you need paperwork either way, but you need extra paperwork if you're going to try to sample from the water below or send a probe down there. And that's because it's fragile. They don't want people who haven't tested out their methods and don't know what they're doing sending things down there where it could possibly contaminate and wipe out the ecosystem. And for those scientists who are working on Blood Falls who hope to collect samples or send probes in, they have to clarify why their research needs to be done, why they need to go under the ice, and why it needs to be done here. And in general, Antarctic research now has to pass the why does this have to be done in Antarctica test to be justified. And the dry valleys in general are an ASPA, as I mentioned. Different zones within the dry valleys are set aside at different levels of restrictiveness. So Blood Falls is within the dry valleys, and it's specially protected even within there. The dry valleys as a whole are also protected. And so we had a lot of permits that let us camp there and collect non-biological samples, meaning rocks, and fly helicopters to a number of sites. But there were still some areas that we were told to not walk through because they had unique soil crust that we could trample on or microorganisms in that soil that we could trample on. And this all had to be documented, from the GPS coordinates to all of our landing and campsites to those of every single rock sample, which of course we wanted anyway, because when doing geology, you need to know where your samples are. But it had the double purpose of confirming where we had left an impact, where we had physically removed rock. Because even if it's just a couple geologists doing research, it's still going to leave an impact, and you obviously don't want tons of geologists doing that all year round. In a sense, that would be mining, which we'll talk more about that. And indeed, some economic activity occurs in regards to fishing or tourism. According to the Antarctic Treaty, nothing in the treaty shall affect the rights of any states with regards to the high seas, which means that the treaty doesn't specifically control fishing in Antarctic waters, which are considered to be international waters that don't belong to any nation. But nonetheless, international waters are not a free-for-all, and a number of the subsequent amendments to the treaty under the treaty system have been designed to put fishing quotas in place to curb overfishing. And there are actually various fossil fuels in Antarctica and various minerals speculated to exist based on rock type. But the treaty explicitly bans mining, and no present extraction is occurring either in Antarctica or in the waters. So we'll talk about fossil fuels first. It's unclear how much oil is in Antarctica or the surrounding waters, but one estimate suggested there could be about 200 billion barrels, and that's on the scale of the total reserves of the country of Saudi Arabia. And of course, Antarctica is not going to become a petrostate. extraction is totally banned under the Antarctic Treaty, at least until 2048, and it is also seen as being prohibitively expensive. There's some oil actually in Victoria Land in a basin, but lingering uneasy questions about how desperate the world is going to be for fossil fuels by 2048 are cause for concern. And then also what political forces are going to be at work that might really make a hard push for this to be relaxed in a new version of the treaty, or for the treaty to be done away with, completely. And that kind of stuff kind of spooks me a little bit. And meanwhile, oil is being extracted in the Falkland Islands. There's rich oil fields off the shores of the Falkland Islands, which are controlled by the UK, and outside of the region controlled by the Antarctic Treaty. So there is believed to be significant oil south of this in the sub-Antarctic islands. And of course, building oil platforms in the Drake Passage in the Southern Ocean would be really dangerous because it's stormy, it's windy, and that really increases the risk of mechanical failure and oil leaks. Meanwhile, also, actually, that brings up the potential for more geopolitical conflict, because one reason Argentina has been feuding with the UK over the Falklands is the oil in the Falklands. And the question of who would own the oil in the Antarctic would also become a geopolitical nightmare. There's also coal known from Antarctica. Remember that we learned in the Earth History Unit that coal formed in Antarctica when the entire continent, during the aptly named Carboniferous period, was covered with coal swamps, with these steamy swamps of club mosses and ferns and conifers that, before completely decaying, were buried and solidified into coal. And it's mostly known from the Transantarctic Mountains, where it's been uplifted since. That would also be prohibitively expensive to access, and it is also banned. No one also really knows quite how much is there. But again, 2048 is not that far off. It is 27 years from now, and I will be in my 50s then. So yeah, I occasionally kind of get spooked out thinking about this. Meanwhile, there is a specific protocol to the treaty, the Madrid Protocol, or the Protocol on Environmental Protection, that bans all activities related to mining that are not scientific. So this means that my advisor and I could get a permit to remove, in total, several tons of rock from the dry valleys. Of course, none of those had any economic minerals of note. We were looking at them to look at mantle chemistry as well as figure out how old they are. But a mining company could not do this. We were taking these tons off the continent to study them for science and publish the results in papers. A mining company that wanted to take samples to see if they would want to go back and make money extracting them is not allowed to do that. And it's really not clear how rich in minerals Antarctica actually is, and a lot of it is based on educated guesses. For example, Western Australia is very rich in minerals, and Western Australia shares a geologic history with East Antarctica. Remember that it was attached until very, very recently, geologically speaking, until the Oligocene, and remember that fossils have been found across both continents, and structures that resemble each other have been found on both continents. But the southernmost tip of Western Australia, which is the part that would have most directly touched Antarctica, doesn't have quite as many minerals. And with that, and also with how much ice covers Antarctica, it's not clear how much Antarctica would be rich in minerals. It's very speculative and based on similar geology, because most minerals are ultimately laid down by processes related to plate tectonics and volcanism. If you have widespread volcanism, for example, the fluids associated with that will leave behind the deposits that then become extractable mineral deposits. So chromium is one potential mineral that has been suggested to be present in East Antarctica based on this, but they haven't confirmed any deposits. Similarly, southern South America was also, until quite recently, attached to Antarctica. And southern South America is rich in copper, which has led some geologists to propose that rich copper deposits might be found in geologically similar areas in the Antarctic Peninsula, because of its, until recently, very shared history. But they haven't found any deposits just yet. They haven't looked very closely, but they also haven't found anything. Iron ore is known to be common in Antarctica, though, because they find a lot of glacial debris that has iron ore in it coming out of the East Antarctic ice sheet, but it's clearly mostly coming from under the glacier, and that would require dangerous and destructive techniques to get to any of it. They would have to blow up glaciers, which, yeah, let's not do that. Fishing is allowed to some extent, but it's not completely also without problems. So the conservation of Antarctica marine living resources is part of the treaty system, and it technically applies to all waters south of the Antarctic convergence, the front, rather than a line of latitude. And it sets conservation standards for krill, Antarctic toothfish, and other species, and sets sustainable use limits. Like, okay, this is the number that can be taken in this year without adversely affecting the population, or this is our best guess for that. And it does not directly address whaling or sealing. It excludes marine mammals. And this is one example of how protecting one area is only going to go so far, because the waters north of the Antarctic convergence, which are not covered under the treaty at all, have been overfished. And this has led fishing crews that were based south of Australia or New Zealand or in southern South America or south of South Africa to start venturing farther south into Antarctic waters and start fishing there. And some of this has been illegal. Some of it has been perfectly legal, but there is a lot of illegal fishing happening also now. So the Patagonian toothfish is one type of toothfish that lives north of the convergence, and it has been heavily overfished. So fishermen have headed south to Antarctica, and they have begun hunting the similar Antarctic toothfish, which we talked about before during the marine ecology unit. And some of this has been legal, but there have also been people not recording their catches, or people claiming that they're fishing farther north, but then heading south without registering it. And it's kind of hard to enforce that. And with illegal fishing taking place on top of the set quotas, and with enforcement being kind of iffy, some people have proposed that the quotas need to be set lower to take into account the fact that illegal fishing is going to keep happening. And the tooth fishing really ramped up in the 90s. Before 1996, McMurdo would do a survey of marine life, and they would catch hundreds, like 100 or 200 toothfish in a season. And in 2007, they only caught 2 because the population had been so overfished. Toothfish are a type of fish that grow slowly and reproduce slowly. So now Antarctic toothfish are being overfished and overexploited as well. And the takeaway is that as long as surrounding stocks of fish remain overfished, Antarctica's marine life is going to be at risk. And global conservation of fisheries needs to happen on a systematic and global scale. You can't just set aside one area as a marine reserve and expect it to be unaffected. And whaling has not completely ceased either. Now, in 1946, there was a consensus that something needed to be done about whaling before they just completely went extinct, because that's what whale species were on the road to. So in 1946, an International Whaling Commission was established. And this was done to conserve whale stocks and to develop an orderly whaling industry. So it was not set aside for preservation. It wasn't set aside to save whales or to protect all the whales. It was set aside to let their populations recover so that a regulated whaling industry might be possible again. Now, that hasn't really happened because, as it turns out, whale populations have been pretty slow to recover because whales are very slow to breed and they live a long time. In general, animals that only produce a few offspring and take a long time to grow, if you wipe out a lot of them, they will take a very, very long time to see their population recover. So in recent years, the Whaling Commission has served more of a preservational purpose. In 1986, they declared a commercial moratorium on whaling, and so no commercial whaling happens today, essentially, in the Antarctic. But a small number of countries have continued to whale for scientific purposes, which has been controversial. One nation has been Norway, which has very heavily cut down on this under international pressure, and another is Japan. Because Japan has really ramped up their whaling program in recent years, and they hunt minke whales and a few others under the guise of expeditions for research. And they are allowed to technically under an exception that was made for research. But they take a lot more than you would expect. In a 2-year, in between 2005 and 2007, for example, they took 850 minke whales, which is kind of a lot. And I don't know why you'd need to kill that many for scientific purposes. So on top of any science being done, the government has also sold the whale meat wholesale to supermarkets in Japan for consumers to eat, which is also controversial because should people be eating whale meat because of mercury poisoning and also conservation? The Japanese government has asserted that this is justified, and they've they don't want other nations meddling with them, and they've asserted that it is a Japanese tradition. The funny thing is that outside of a few whaling communities, widespread consumption of whales only really started in Japan in World War II with food shortages. And so some Japanese activists who are opposed to whaling have referred to this as an invented tradition just used by the government to justify its grandstanding, basically. And it is kind of seen as a grandstanding and kind of a neo-imperialist act of sorts. And Japan has been under a lot of pressure to stop this, and under a lot of domestic opposition as well, including from people who don't want their children fed whale meat. In one case, I remember when I watched a documentary on this. But the government has continued the practice. So whaling continues, and it's still rather controversial because of the justification used for it. Meanwhile, outside of fishing, the main activity economically is tourism, and mostly by cruise ships. And cruise ships will often visit the sub-Antarctic islands. They'll stop at South Georgia for visitors to see the Grytviken whaling station, as well as Shackleton's grave there. And they'll peruse the Antarctic waters, looking at glaciers or looking for whales. And occasionally, groups of tourists for a large fee can embark at Palmer or McMurdo or other bases to sightsee and buy souvenirs at the gift shop, or buy alcohol, I guess. I don't know if they're allowed to buy alcohol, but I'm just kind of thinking of that. There would always be lots of people buying alcohol at McMurdo. But in the meantime, tourism has potential to do good. It can promote environmental awareness, and it could also provide revenue to impoverished countries who need the revenue. In truth, a lot of the countries that have gone have been from, a lot of the ships that have gone have been from developed nations, a lot from the United States, mostly from Europe, actually, a significant wedge from China now, actually, now that China's economy has gotten bigger. But anyhow, there are some risks from tourism, and tourists in general are going to receive less training and background on how to just operate and recreate responsibly in Antarctica. And scientists are going to get more information. Tourists often aren't going to get it drilled into their heads as much that you need to be careful here. And that's sometimes really the fault of the tourism companies as much as the people. But there's more of a risk to damaging wildlife and natural features from just bringing in tourists and then bringing in people with training. There's the risk of pollution, both from the ships dumping fuel or ballast, or from individual carelessness, like people dropping trash over the edge. And some people really question how accessible Antarctica should be to people who don't have specialized training, because it's a very fragile ecosystem in many ways. Tourism has declined since 2008. The recession happened then, and there's also been a ban on heavy fuels that was enacted out of contamination concerns, and that has actually reduced the number of ships that can go to Antarctica. The treaty doesn't say anything explicitly about tourism, actually, but it is binding for anybody who is in Antarctica. And I think that fact needs to be made a lot more clear to anybody who considers coming down there. Like, you are in a very special place. These are the rules you're going to follow. If you don't follow them, you are getting kicked out. Because that's kind of what was said to me. And I think anybody who goes anywhere near Antarctica kind of needs to have that in mind. And a full-scale war has never occurred in Antarctica, thankfully. The treaty was largely drawn up to prevent this. But in areas directly north of the treaty in the Southern Ocean, there have been a number of incidents, and that's indicated what could happen if the treaty were to lapse or if enforcement were to lapse. In 1979, the Vela satellite, which was a telecommunications satellite, detected a double flash in the South Indian Ocean. A double flash is characteristic of atomic explosions. And this was on Prince Edward Island, which is a small uninhabited island between South Africa and Antarctica. It's controlled by South Africa, actually. And this was known as the Vela incident. People don't really know for sure what happened, but it's generally agreed that this was an illegal nuclear test conducted by the South African government, by the apartheid-era government. The island is not covered under the treaty, so they couldn't really do anything, but it's close by, and it indicates that if they could, many countries would happily use some of these islands for nuclear tests. The South African government has actually gotten rid of its nuclear program since the fall of apartheid. It's the only country that is known to have had nuclear weapons that no longer does so. And the most famous example is the Falklands War, which in many ways was kind of a ridiculous little bit of grandstanding by two right-wing politicians. But anyway, the most prominent, the Falklands are known as the Islas Malvinas in Argentina. And as I've mentioned, they've been a source of contention between the two countries, between the UK and Argentina, for a long time. The Falklands never had an indigenous population, and they were claimed variously by Britain, Spain, and France after their discovery, and as whaling and sealing brought more people there. Argentina became an independent country during the Napoleonic Wars, and they claimed them immediately after and sent a party of settlers. But then the British showed up, drove them off, and established their own base, which understandably Argentina has never been too happy about. So the present population consists of a few thousand English-speaking people of European descent, but Argentina has continued to claim the islands, and that has become a little more of a prudent claim for them now. They've reiterated this claim now that oil is known from the Falkland Islands area. So Argentina was controlled by military dictatorships for a lot of the 20th century, and these administrations took a much harder line against British influence. So in 1982, the president of the dictatorship was Leopoldo Galtieri. If you listen to a very obscure Pink Floyd song called "Get Your Filthy Hands Off My Desert," you'll hear Roger Waters sing, "Galtieri took the Union Jack," and that's what he's referring to. And so he ordered an invasion and took Stanley, the capital of the Falklands, and also occupied South Georgia and claimed South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. Conservative British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, also known as the Iron Lady, ordered a counterattack. She was hoping to use it to rally support for herself and to rally British nationalism in the process. This was after Britain's colonies had mostly gained independence, and it was in many ways it was seen as a little bit of a throwback to British imperialism. In any case, Galtieri didn't really have an easy time rallying any popular support. People in Argentina, the average people in Argentina didn't care that much. The army was really unpopular because it had been randomly executing people, and the desaparecidos had been murdered. So the army didn't have a lot of popular support in Argentina, and the islands were far and pretty hard to defend, and also not inhabited by Argentinians at this point. So the Argentinian government had a pretty hard time holding the islands, and the UK attacked them in full force and drove them off. And within a few months, the UK was in full control again. Argentina surrendered, but they never formally gave up their claim to the Falkland Islands, and tensions between the two still remain strained. The UK they've never really come to an understanding about this. And it is an indication of what could happen in Antarctica if the treaty were to lapse. It's a little bit of a different situation because there are people living on the Falklands now, but there's a lot of potential for conflict, especially if questions of mining rights or oil rights come into play again. And on a bit of a different note, the last subject I want to address related to modern Antarctica is kind of Antarctica in art and the media, because I find this rather interesting. And Antarctica has often appeared as kind of a mythical land with properties often really unlike the actual continent. This was both before it was discovered and people knew it as Terra Incognita Australis, and afterwards, when the continent was still very poorly known. And even today, you still come with stories where you still come across stories where Antarctica is secretly a jungle, or Antarctica is where Hitler's base was, or stuff like that. That was a conspiracy theory that was around for a long time, that Hitler had a secret Antarctic base. But it's also served as the basis for adventure stories with the memory of the heroic age, and it can also kind of serve as a blank slate or tabula rasa, where you can kind of put whatever you want there. One example of that is Watchmen, where Ozymandias has his hideout there, and he has a sort of pleasure dome that has advanced technology to keep out the cold and wind and allow a tropical forest to exist inside. Of course, this particular panel is during the scene when he opens it up and destroys everything inside. A weirder example, I like anime. I've alluded to one example of a Japanese anime about exploration called A Place Further Than the Universe, but I came across another show with an even stranger Antarctica connection, a show called A Centaur's Life, in which the world is inhabited by satyrs and centaurs and mermaids rather than people, and Antarctica is home to a race of sentient reptiles, one of whom comes to Japan as an exchange student. And I am assuming that they must have evolved warm-bloodedness, but that's one of the more interesting uses of Antarctica I've come across, the Antarctic and snake people. And Antarctica entered the realm of literature pretty early on, actually, during the era of sealing and whaling, when people were down there, even before the heroic age put the adventure novel on the radar much more. Edgar Allan Poe is much more famous for writing short stories and poems like The Raven. He wrote one complete novel. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket is what it is called, and it is set aboard a whaling vessel because Nantucket was where a lot of the whaling ships headed from. It is a very densely written adventure story. I've read bits of it, and it's very hard to read, frankly. But it ends on a cliffhanger, and the main character is trapped in Antarctica. So Jules Verne, and a lot of people were kind of like, why did you write this? Like, why does it just stop? One person who did like it was Jules Verne, who is the science fiction writer famous for Around the World in 80 Days, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and a bunch of other 19th century steampunk and sci-fi novels. And he wrote his own sequel, An Antarctic Mystery, which also is not his best well-known book, but it's interesting that the guy who wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea also wrote a book about Antarctica. Poe's novel is really racist. It has some really awful depictions of Black people. He uses these fictional savage dark-skinned natives in the subantarctic islands as a plot device, and it's really kind of awful and caricatured and racist. And in general, there's been issues. In general, I've alluded to the fact that throughout the history of exploration, there's colonialism lingering in the background, and the exploration was mostly done by imperial powers, mostly European imperial powers. A Black American writer recently wrote a book called Pym, which kind of reinterprets Poe's novel and kind of satirizes the casual racism and whiteness of Antarctic explorer narratives, or just the casual racism of the era, I meant. And he looks at it with more of an ironic and critical look of kind of the colonial and imperial elements of polar exploration. I haven't read the whole thing myself, but I've been meaning to check it out because I think it's an interesting take and kind of a new take that hasn't really been exhibited before. And we're not quite done with the people history of Antarctica because we have to talk about climate change. So that will be next week's topic, and I will get that out on schedule. I appreciate you being patient with this material all being a bit delayed. One thing I do want to mention is that I believe I will be holding my review session next week on Wednesday instead of Monday, just to give people more time to get caught up on this lecture and the previous one. So I will send an email out about that. Enjoy your weekend, and again, thanks for being patient.